In the middle of the 14th century, people went to bed healthy and woke up dying. There was no warning, no slow decline, no time to prepare. A fever arrived suddenly, burning through the body like wildfire. Within hours, victims were racked with pain. Dark, egg-sized swellings appeared beneath the arms, along the neck, and in the groin. Angry, pulsating masses that throbbed with every heartbeat. These swellings were a death sentence. Once they appeared, survival was rare. Entire families vanished in days, sometimes in hours. Church bells rang without pause. At first, they tolled for the dead, one by one. Then they rang for entire streets. Eventually, they rang so often that cities stopped counting altogether. Graveyards filled past capacity. Fresh graves were dug into old ones. Bones surfaced where children once played. Streets that had echoed with carts, merchants, and shouting voices fell silent, as if the cities themselves were holding their breath. And everywhere, inside churches, inside homes, whispered between neighbors, one question spread faster than the disease itself. Was this the end of the world? What people did not realize was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. A catastrophe so vast that it would erase nearly half of Europe's population in less than 5 years. A biological event so destructive that it would shatter the foundations of medieval society and permanently alter the course of human civilization. This was the Black Death, and once it began, there was no escape. To understand how devastating this collapse truly was, we must first understand what was lost. The world that existed on the eve of the plague was not weak or decaying. It was strong, confident, expanding. The early 14th century marked the peak of the High Middle Ages, an era of prosperity and momentum unmatched since the height of the Roman Empire. For generations, Europe had experienced favorable climate conditions. Warm summers and mild winters allowed harvests to flourish. Food was abundant. Famine, once a constant threat, seemed to be fading into memory. As a result, populations exploded. In just 2 centuries, Europe's population nearly doubled. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Ancient Roman walls were pushed outward, then abandoned entirely as urban centers spilled into the surrounding countryside. Cities like Paris, Florence, Venice, and London became dense, chaotic hives of human activity. Narrow streets twisted between timber houses stacked multiple stories high. Markets overflowed with goods. Ships arrived daily carrying grain, wine, wool, metals, and luxuries from distant lands. This was not a world expecting collapse. It was a world convinced of its own ascent. Towering over everything were the cathedrals. Across Europe, massive Gothic structures rose stone by stone, stretching toward the heavens. They were feats of engineering never before attempted at such scale. Flying buttresses, stained glass walls, vaulted ceilings that seemed to defy gravity itself. These cathedrals were not just religious buildings, they were declarations. Proof that medieval society believed it was closer to God, more advanced, and more capable than any generation before it. But the true strength of this world lay not just in stone and faith. It lay in connection. The medieval world was deeply interconnected. Trade routes spanned continents, linking Europe to the Middle East, India, and East Asia. Merchants traveled thousands of miles without ever leaving a protected commercial network. Silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from Africa flowed into European ports with unprecedented speed and volume. This vast system functioned like a medieval version of a global internet. Goods moved, ideas moved, technology moved, knowledge moved. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had crossed deserts, mountains, and empires, all without ever seeing the lands it passed through. This interconnectedness created wealth, stability, and optimism on a scale Europe had never known. It also created the perfect infrastructure for disaster. Because the same ships and caravans that carried prosperity were carrying something else as well. Something invisible, something ancient, something lethal. Europe did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was successful. The population density that fueled economic growth became a death trap. The crowded cities that encouraged trade allowed disease to spread unchecked. The trade routes that brought wealth also carried contagion faster than any army ever could. The very systems that made medieval civilization thrive were the same systems that would help destroy it, and no one saw it coming. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of infection. Disease was believed to arise from bad air, divine punishment, or cosmic imbalance. When illness struck, people searched the skies, not microscopes. They prayed, not quarantined. They rang bells, lit candles, and gathered together, unwittingly accelerating the spread. The Black Death did not arrive in a world prepared for crisis. It arrived in a world convinced of its own stability. And when it struck, it did not just attack bodies. It attacked the illusion that human systems, faith, trade, authority, knowledge, could protect civilization from nature itself. In hindsight, the signs were already there. Europe's rapid population growth had pushed society to its limits. Cities were filthy. Waste flowed through open streets. Animals lived among humans. Rats thrived in homes, markets, and ships. Fleas were everywhere. All it took was one spark. That spark was already moving. Far beyond Europe's borders, something had begun to shift. A biological process that had existed quietly for centuries was about to collide with human ambition on a global scale. And when it did, the world that believed itself safe would discover how fragile it truly was. The bells had only just begun to ring. The end of the medieval world did not begin in Europe. It did not begin in a city, a port, or a palace. It began far away, in places most Europeans would never see and could barely imagine, on the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia. This was a land of extremes. Endless grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken only by distant mountains and open sky. Winters were brutal. Summers were unforgiving. For thousands of years, humans had passed through these regions without ever suspecting what lived beneath the soil. Burrowing rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, and gerbils thrived here, living in complex underground colonies. And within their blood lived an ancient biological passenger. It had no ambition, no awareness, no intent, only efficiency. For centuries, this bacterium existed in a stable ecological balance. It circulated quietly among rodents, passed from animal to animal by fleas. Hosts lived, hosts died. The cycle continued. Human beings remained mostly outside this system, separated by geography and distance. Then the environment changed. In the early 14th century, climate patterns across Central Asia began to destabilize. Evidence points to periods of severe drought followed by heavy rains. Grasslands failed. Food sources collapsed. Rodent populations were forced out of their natural habitats in search of survival. As they moved, they brought their fleas with them, and those fleas were hungry. The leap from animal to human did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, in forgotten trading posts and roadside settlements along the Silk Road. Caravan towns that existed solely to support merchants moving goods between empires became the first human testing grounds for the plague. Travelers arrived healthy and left feverish. Locals fell ill without explanation. Death followed swiftly. The symptoms were unmistakable, even if the cause was not. high fevers, violent vomiting, crushing fatigue. And then the swellings. Painful, dark, grotesque enlargements of the lymph nodes that appeared wherever the body tried and failed to fight the infection. These swellings, called buboes, were so distinctive they would later give the disease its name. Once the buboes appeared, death usually followed within days. But in the medieval world, news traveled slowly. There were no newspapers, no instant communication, no global awareness. Instead, information spread through rumor, fragmented reports, and frightened storytelling. By the time word reached Europe, it arrived not as a clear warning, but as myth. Merchants spoke of entire regions in the east vanishing, of cities emptied overnight, of pestilence so severe it left fields untended and roads abandoned. Some claimed fire rained from the sky. Others believed God had turned his face away from Asia entirely. These stories reached Mediterranean ports in pieces, distorted by distance and disbelief. Europe listened and dismissed them. The disasters were far away, exotic, other. If death was sweeping through India, Tartary, or Mesopotamia, it was unfortunate but irrelevant. Many believed it was divine punishment for foreign beliefs or moral corruption. There was no sense of shared vulnerability. No understanding that the same trade routes carrying silk, spices, and wealth were carrying something far more dangerous. What Europe failed to grasp was that it was no longer isolated. The medieval world was not a collection of separate regions, it was a connected system, and systems fail together. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of paths, caravans, ships, and relay points. It linked China to the Middle East, Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Empires rose and fell along its length, but the flow of trade endured. Goods changed hands dozens of times before reaching their final destination. And with every exchange, the plague moved closer. Fleas hid in cloth bundles, rats nested in grain stores, caravans slept in roadside inns where animals and humans shared space. Every night was another opportunity for transmission. Every mile westward was another step toward catastrophe. By the early 1340s, the plague had reached the edges of the Black Sea. Here, the world's great land routes met the sea lanes of Europe. This was the critical junction, the place where a regional disaster could become a global one. At the center of this junction sat a city that symbolized medieval globalization itself. Caffa. Caffa was not simply a town. It was a fortress of wealth, trade, and ambition. A Genoese colony built on the Crimean Peninsula, it served as the primary gateway between Asia and Europe. Inside its massive stone walls lived merchants from across the known world. Italians, Armenians, Greeks, and traders from deeper east all converged here, exchanging goods that would soon be shipped across the Mediterranean. It was a city designed to withstand armies. Thick walls, armed guards, naval protection. From a military standpoint, it was nearly impregnable. Biology did not care. In 1346, Caffa became trapped in a siege. An army from the east surrounded the city, cutting it off from land access. At first, this was just another medieval conflict, long, brutal, and expected. The defenders relied on their walls and ships. Supplies still arrived by sea. The standoff dragged on. Then soldiers in the besieging camps began to die, not from wounds, not from hunger, from disease. Bodies darkened, fevers raged. Death spread through the camps faster than any weapon. The army that had traveled thousands of miles began to collapse from within, and faced with defeat by an enemy they could not fight, a decision was made, one that would echo through history. Death would be turned into a weapon. What followed would transform the plague from an Eastern catastrophe into a European apocalypse. And the ships waiting in Caffa's harbour were about to carry it west. Caffa was supposed to be untouchable. Rising above the Black Sea on the Crimean Peninsula, its thick stone walls and guarded harbour made it one of the most secure and profitable cities in the medieval world. Merchants inside its gates dealt in silk, spices, gold, and human lives. Everything that moved between Asia and Europe passed through here. Caffa was the hinge of continents, the place where land routes met sea routes, where caravans ended and ships began. And in 1346, it became the place where death crossed into Europe. The siege began like countless others before it. An Eastern army surrounded the city, cutting off overland access. Inside the walls, Genoese defenders remained confident. They had supplies, they had ships, they had time. Medieval warfare was slow, and sieges often lasted months or years. Hunger and disease were usually weapons against the defenders. This time, disease chose a different side. Inside the besieging camps, soldiers began falling ill. At first it was a handful of men, then dozens, then hundreds. Fevers tore through the ranks. Bodies weakened overnight. Dark swellings appeared. Skin blackened. Death followed with terrifying speed. The camps descended into chaos. There were no explanations, no cures, no understanding. The men had not been wounded. They had not starved. Yet they were dying faster than any battle could kill them. Fires burned constantly as commanders attempted to purify the air. Prayers were shouted into the night. Nothing worked. The army was dissolving from the inside. Faced with collapse, the leadership made a decision born of desperation, rage, and terror. If death could not be stopped, it would be used. The bodies of the dead were gathered, swollen, blackened, rotting, and they were loaded into siege engines. Day after day, trebuchets hurled plague-ridden corpses over the walls of Caffa. From inside the city, defenders watched in horror as human bodies smashed into rooftops, streets, and courtyards. The psychological effect was immediate. Panic spread. The stench was overwhelming. The sight alone was enough to break morale, but the true danger was invisible. Fleas abandoned cooling corpses in search of warm, living hosts. Rats fed on the remains. The bacteria found new pathways into the city. The fortress had not been breached by soldiers, but by biology. Soon, people inside Caffa began to fall ill. What had been a military siege became something far worse, a biological catastrophe. Death moved through the city with the same speed and cruelty it had shown in the camps outside. Merchants collapsed in their homes. Dock workers died on the piers. Families locked themselves indoors, only to perish together. The city's greatest strength, its harbour, became its only escape. As panic spread, the wealthiest residents acted first. Genoese merchants rushed to their ships, loading whatever cargo they could salvage. Silks, spices, gold, refugees, rats, fleas. They did not know what caused the sickness, but they knew the city was doomed. 12 ships slipped out of the harbour. They sailed past the dying army, past the walls of Caffa, past the last chance to contain what was happening. And they carried with them the plague in its most efficient form, hidden, mobile, and unstoppable. The ships followed familiar routes. Through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, into the Mediterranean. Every port was a potential landing point. Every stop an opportunity for transmission. Sailors fell ill mid-voyage. Some ships arrived with only a handful of survivors. Others arrived with none at all. But the ships kept moving. The medieval Mediterranean was the beating heart of European commerce. Ports were busy, crowded, and poorly sanitized. Ships docked daily. Cargo was unloaded by hand. Rats moved freely between vessels and shore. When the plague ships arrived, no one understood the danger. The first major port to fall was Messina, in Sicily. When the ships entered the harbor, dock workers rowed out to greet them, only to recoil in horror. Bodies lay rotting on deck. Survivors were delirious, covered in boils, bleeding from open sores. Death was visible, tangible, unmistakable. Authorities ordered the ships expelled immediately, but the order came too late. Rats had already fled the vessels, fleas had already found new hosts, the disease was ashore. Within days, Messina began to collapse. The infection spread with paralyzing speed through narrow streets and crowded homes. People fled into the countryside, unknowingly carrying the plague with them. Sicily became a laboratory of disaster, proving just how quickly civilization could unravel. From there, the pattern repeated. The ships moved on. Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Ports tried to close their harbors. Some succeeded briefly. Others failed due to bribery, desperation, or denial. Medieval quarantine was inconsistent and poorly enforced. The lure of valuable cargo often outweighed fear. By early 1348, the Mediterranean world was collapsing. Venice, one of the richest and most powerful cities on earth, watched death move through its canals. Gondolas became funeral barges. Bodies were piled and transported silently through the water. Entire neighborhoods vanished. The city's leaders scrambled for solutions, experimenting with isolation and delay, unknowingly laying the groundwork for future public health measures. But for now, it was too late. From the coasts, the plague turned inward. It followed rivers, roads, and trade routes. Every cart, every traveler, every shipment became a potential carrier. The disease no longer needed ships. It was inside Europe now. The walls that once protected cities trapped death inside them. What had begun as an ecological disruption on distant steppes had become a continental catastrophe. And the worst was still to come. Because once the plague reached the great cities of Europe's interior, it would not just kill people, it would break civilization itself. When the plague left the coast and turned inward, Europe's great cities became prisons. The disease did not announce itself with armies or banners. It arrived quietly, carried by traders, pilgrims, refugees, and carts creaking along ancient Roman roads. It followed rivers like veins, slipping from port cities into the heart of the continent. And when it reached the walled capitals of medieval Europe, it found the perfect environment to unleash its full horror. Paris, Florence, London, Barcelona. These were not just cities, they were engines of civilization, densely packed, endlessly active, and overwhelmingly alive. Timber houses leaned over narrow streets, blocking out sunlight. Waste flowed openly through gutters. Animals lived among people. Entire families shared single rooms. Once the plague entered these spaces, it moved faster than fear itself. In a major city, the Black Death did not spread gradually. It detonated. Within days of the first cases, the sick overwhelmed households. Within weeks, entire districts collapsed. The disease did not discriminate. Rich and poor fell alike. Merchants died beside beggars. Priests collapsed at the altar. Physicians succumbed while treating patients. The social order did not bend under pressure. It snapped. Medieval medicine was helpless. Doctors were among the most educated people of their time, trained in ancient texts and university traditions. But their understanding of disease was rooted in theories that had nothing to do with reality. They believed illness came from imbalances in bodily fluids or from corrupted air known as miasma. Some blamed planetary alignments, pointing to a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars as the source of poisoned vapors rising from the Earth. Their treatments reflected these beliefs. Patients were bled, weakening bodies already fighting for survival. Buboes were lanced, spreading infection deeper into the bloodstream. People were advised not to bathe, as open pores were thought to invite bad air into the body. Aromatic woods were burned in homes and streets to mask the smell of death. None of it worked. Every attempt to heal only hastened the end. As medicine failed, fear took over. The terror of contagion shattered the most sacred bonds of human society. Parents abandoned children. Children fled their parents. Spouses left one another to die alone. The sick were locked inside homes, sometimes nailed shut from the outside. Entire households vanished without anyone daring to check on them. The machinery of civilization ground to a halt. Courts closed because judges were dead. Laws went unenforced because there were no officials left to enforce them. Bakeries stopped baking. Markets fell silent. Construction ceased mid-stone, leaving unfinished cathedrals frozen in time. The sounds of city life, carts, merchants, craftsmen, were replaced by an oppressive stillness broken only by coughing, screaming, and the tolling of bells. At first, bells rang constantly, announcing each death. Then they rang so often that people could no longer count. Eventually, authorities ordered them silenced, fearing the sound itself was driving survivors mad. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Churchyards filled within weeks. Bodies were stacked atop older graves. When no consecrated ground remained, massive trenches were dug outside city walls. Corpses were thrown in by the dozens, sometimes hundreds at a time, layered like firewood and covered with thin soil. The living could smell these pits from a distance. Death became part of the landscape. In the medieval mind, there was no separation between the physical and the spiritual. A catastrophe of this magnitude could only mean one thing. God was punishing humanity. People flooded into churches praying for mercy. Ironically, these gatherings became perfect breeding grounds for infection. The pneumonic form of the plague, which spread through the air, tore through crowded cathedrals with devastating speed. Priests died as quickly as sinners. Faith offered no immunity. When prayer failed, desperation transformed into fanaticism. Across northern Europe, bands of flagellants appeared. Hundreds of men marched from town to town dressed in identical robes. Twice a day, they gathered in public squares, stripped to the waist, and whipped themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. Blood flowed freely as they chanted hymns and begged God to spare the world. Their logic was simple. If humanity's sins caused the plague, then suffering might appease divine wrath. Instead, they spread fear, hysteria, and disease wherever they went. But even that was not enough. As the death toll climbed, the need for a human explanation grew darker. If God was not listening, perhaps the devil was at work. And if the devil was at work, someone must be helping him. A horrific accusation began to spread. Rumors claimed that Jewish communities were poisoning wells, conspiring to wipe out Christian populations. These accusations had no basis in reality. Jews were dying of the plague just as quickly as everyone else. But logic had no place in a world unraveling under terror. Despite official condemnations from religious authorities, the rumors ignited centuries of simmering hatred. Pogroms erupted across parts of Europe. Entire communities were rounded up, imprisoned, and burned alive. Cities that had once been centers of trade and coexistence became sites of mass murder. The Black Death did not just kill with bacteria. It exposed the darkest instincts of humanity. And it did not stop at city walls. While urban centers were the epicenters of death, the countryside soon followed. Refugees fleeing cities carried the disease into rural villages. Peddlers and travelers unknowingly became vectors. In some areas, The spread was slower, but the impact was no less devastating. Whole villages disappeared, fields went unharvested, crops rotted where they stood, livestock wandered unattended, sheep turned feral, cows collapsed in pastures with no one left to tend them, wolves, emboldened by the absence of humans, crept closer to abandoned settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape began reverting to wilderness. The manorial system, the backbone of medieval society, collapsed under the weight of death. Lords had land, but no laborers. Rents went unpaid. Obligations dissolved. The structure that had defined European life for centuries was quietly disintegrating. By the time the plague reached the farthest corners of the continent, Scotland, Scandinavia, even the remote Norse settlements of Greenland, Europe was already broken. This was no longer a crisis of health. It was a collapse of civilization itself. By the early 1350s, the killing slowed, not because the plague had been defeated, but because there was almost no one left to infect. The Black Death burned itself out through sheer exhaustion. Entire populations had already been consumed. Villages stood empty. Cities echoed with absence. The bacterium, having ripped through Europe with merciless efficiency, finally encountered the one enemy it could not overcome: a lack of human hosts. When the fog of death began to lift, survivors stepped into a world that felt alien. The buildings were familiar. The streets were the same. But the people were gone. Half of Europe had vanished in less than 5 years. Parents, children, priests, craftsmen, nobles, entire generations erased. The silence was overwhelming. In many places there were not enough living to bury the dead properly. Mass graves were sealed and forgotten. Homes remained locked, their occupants long dead inside. Churches stood open but empty. Fields lay fallow, overtaken by weeds. Roads once crowded with carts and pilgrims were reclaimed by grass and animals. The Black Death left behind more than corpses. It left behind a psychological wound unlike anything Europe had ever experienced. Survivors struggled to understand why they had lived while others had not. Faith had failed to protect the devout. Wealth had not saved the rich. Medicine had proven powerless. The idea that the world operated according to divine order or human control was shattered. Nothing felt guaranteed anymore. Not God's favor, not social hierarchy, not even tomorrow. Yet out of this devastation, something unexpected began to emerge. Power shifted. Before the plague, Europe had been crowded, labor was cheap, landlords and nobles held overwhelming control. Peasants had little leverage. Survival depended on obedience. After the plague, everything changed. There were vast stretches of land with no one left to work them. Farms stood empty, workshops were abandoned. Lords suddenly found themselves desperate. For the first time in centuries, labor was scarce. Survivors discovered they could demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedom. If one lord refused, another would accept. Laws were passed, attempting to freeze wages and force peasants back into submission, but enforcement was weak. Too many officials were dead. Too many systems had collapsed. The rigid structure of serfdom began to crack. In some regions, it collapsed entirely. This period would later be remembered as the golden age of the laborer, a world where ordinary people, through unimaginable suffering, gained bargaining power they had never possessed before. The Black Death had destroyed millions of lives, but it had also destabilized centuries-old hierarchies. The transformation reached far beyond economics. Art changed. Before the plague, medieval art celebrated divine order, heavenly reward, and eternal stability. After the plague, death dominated the imagination. murals and manuscripts filled with skeletons dancing alongside kings, popes, merchants, and peasants alike. This imagery became known as the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Its message was unmistakable. Death does not care who you are. No crown could stop it. No prayer could delay it. No wealth could bribe it. The plague had taught Europe a brutal lesson. Mortality was the great equalizer. Even religion was transformed. The church had been the unquestioned center of medieval life. During the plague, it failed to provide protection or explanation. Priests died just as easily as sinners. Some fled their congregations. Others were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of death. Confidence in religious authority weakened. People did not abandon faith, but they questioned it. This questioning would not explode immediately, but it planted seeds. Seeds that would eventually grow into the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern scientific mindset. The Black Death did not create the modern world overnight, but it cleared the ground. It forced adaptation. It shattered assumptions. It reminded humanity that nature, not tradition, sets the rules. By the late 14th century, Europe began to rebuild, slowly, painfully, differently. Cities refilled, but with caution. Trade resumed, but with new awareness. Governments experimented with public health measures, quarantine and isolation, ideas that would later save countless lives. The world moved forward, carrying the memory of catastrophe like a scar. And yet, for centuries, the Black Death was treated as a medieval nightmare, a relic of a brutal, ignorant past. Something humanity had outgrown, but empty streets, locked homes, fear of the air itself. These are not ancient sensations, they are familiar. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a test of civilization's resilience, of human behavior under extreme fear, of how societies respond when their systems fail all at once. And history has a way of repeating its tests. Different pathogen, different century, same questions. How do we react when knowledge fails? Who do we blame when fear takes over? What systems collapse and which ones survive? The Black Death reshaped the world, not because it killed millions, but because it revealed how fragile civilization truly is. And once that truth is seen, it can never be unseen.